the last video we talked about the Node Package Manager. We initialized our Node Package Manager app, and we installed a module into our Node Package Manager app. We are going to be leaving that, and we are going to be learning something in JavaScript today called Asynchronous. So go back to your Node Basics folder and create a new file called asynchronous.js. Now, before we begin learning asynchronous is like when multiple things are running concurrently, which means they are running at the same time. In JavaScript also, we can have functions that are running in parallel with other functions. Those functions are called asynchronous functions. A good example would be, for example, we have a function display that displays, let's say our function display just consoles console.log this works to the screen. Then we can have another function. Let's use the JavaScript set timeout function. A JavaScript set timeout function is used to delay an action. It receives two arguments. The first argument is a callback, which inside the callback you write what you want your code to do. So our callback will be the display, and then the second argument is the time you want it to be delayed for. So let's use 3000 because the argument receives milliseconds, so let's use 3000 to depict 3 seconds. So let's go ahead and run this node asynchronous.js, and what we can see happens is it waits for 3 seconds and then it displays this works to the screen. So what's noticing here is that we have two functions, and these two functions are running simultaneously. So no matter how many computations that we have in here, this display function and this set timeout function will be running at the same time. So now we know that you can send, for example, you want to cook and maybe you don't have salt, so you send someone salt. When you send someone salt, you are waiting for the person to bring back the salt so you can put in your stew to cook. It also happens in programming also. We have something called production codes, and production codes are codes that can take some time. For example, you send the person to a far distance. For example, to maybe your code requires something that is that will require some hardcore computation before you can get it. So those are production codes. Then we also have consuming codes, which are codes that must wait for a result. Which an example of that is you will send someone, you want to cook, and you have to wait for that person because you can't cook without adding what you want to add to the food. So in this kind of case, what you have to do is you use a promise, which is in real life you wait for the person. In JavaScript you have to use a promise function to depict that. A promise is a JavaScript object that links a code that is dependent on another. So it links the two codes, the one that is depending and the one that is coming. You understand? So let's delete what we have and let's go ahead to create an example of a promise. So you create promise using it's a JavaScript object. So you create promise. Let's say let my promise be equal to, you use the new keyword and you use the promise. So new promise. Now it receives two arguments. It receives one callback. So let's create our callback inside here, and the function will receive two arguments, which is what you resolve and maybe in case an error occurs, so if you reject it. So you can have my resolve, and you can have my reject. Just keep following. I'll explain everything as soon as I'm done with it. My reject, and that's our function. Then what we have to do is we have to tell what happens if it has resolved that. So my resolve, then my reject, So we'll go ahead and create a new statement. Let's say if, for example, A plus B, or let's just say if A is equal to 4, then my resolve is, let's take out my resolve and put inside this if statement and say my resolve is it's resolved A is 4. Then we can just use an else statement to say error comma A is not 4. So let's go over here and now declare our variable A, and let's say A is equal to 2 plus 2, which is 4. So we've created our first promise. Breaking this down, a promise receives a callback function that has two arguments, which is my resolve and my reject. So reason for maybe there's a failure or maybe there's a success. So now to call this promise, after you create a promise, after the promise is met, after the condition is met, after this promise is done running, you can just say my promise, run my promise. Then it has, since it's a promise, it has another property called .then. Now .then is a function and it also receives a callback. Now the callback that it receives is the first one. It receives two functions. It receives, the first function will be what happens when my resolve is met. So for example, we have it receives two callbacks. The first one is my resolve. So let's say if it's resolved, you can just say value, and since it's a function, let's use the function, let's declare a function rather. So function value is equal to, no, let's do this. The first one is, so if it is resolved, then what happens is we just say console.log value. If we go ahead and run this, we can see it's resolved. A is 4. Now what happens here is that we created a promise. So all this action is inside the promise. That okay, first you add 2 plus 2 into variable A. Then if A is equal to 4, then you resolve that it's resolved. A is equal to 4. And if it's rejected, if A is not equal to 4, you reject it and say error, A is not 4. So now we are calling that promise. We have created a promise. We are calling the promise. So after this promise, and like in my former example, after the person has come from market, then you say then you console.log the value. Let me just give an instance. Let me put that in real life terms. So for example, you want to say that when the person returns from the market, put the salt inside the soup. You understand? So you say my promise dot then. So after the promise is made done, then do this. But if there is an error, okay, let me change this from my resolve. So let's say 2 plus 2 means the person has come back from the market. So arrived with salt. Put in stew. So now if we go ahead and do this, then we can see arrived with salt, put in stew. So if the person goes to the market and is not able to come back with the salt, then it has to be a rejection. So then, like I said, the dot then receives 2 arguments for a promise. Then what happens is we have function reject. Let's say error. Let's say the error. So we can just say it should console dot log the error, and let's now say error no salt. So if we go ahead and run this, we still get arrived with salt. And in the event that the person did not get, let's say that's a different case other than 4, which is 5. If we go ahead and run this, we can see error no salt. So this dot then is used to this dot then waits for a promise. When it waits for that promise, depending on the result of that promise, then it now takes an action. The resolve it does, then the error it also does. So like I said, a recap is we have producing codes that take some time. This one might not take some time, but imagine you want to fetch weather API for the whole world and you want to use it in your code. That might take some time and you will definitely have to wait for it. So that way you have to create it as a promise, and after that promise is fulfilled, then you just have to perform the action that you want to perform. So another thing we want to learn, I hope this is clear enough. If you have any issue, you can just reach out to me on Slack. Another thing we want to learn is the asynchronous function, but I'll leave it at this today. If you have any question, hit out to me on Slack, and tomorrow we'll try to do a recap of this and then go ahead to learn asynchronous function and then start building with NPM. So thank you.